Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Labour is promising to put 10,000 more police on the streets of England and Wales if it wins the election. The party said it would fund the policy by reversing Conservative plans for cuts to capital gains tax. The Conservatives say the proposal is nonsensical, as Labour has committed those savings to fund other pledges. Our political guru Norman Smith is at Westminster. So do the sums add up on this one, Norman?
That's a very good question, Vic, but I suppose what strikes me most about today is we get a bit of a curveball from Jeremy Corbyn, a bit of a sort of change of tack, because in the campaign so far he's pretty much stuck to sort of core Corbyn campaign themes around opposing austerity, more cash for the NHS, fighting back against benefit cuts, those sort of traditional Jeremy Corbyn messages. Today, he almost takes a leaf out of the Tony Blair book and goes on crime, not something you have heard Jeremy Corbyn talk much about, but pledging that Labour would seek to reverse some of the cuts that they say have been implemented since 2010, with a 20% cut in police budgets, something like 20,000 fewer police officers, and instead they say they would recruit 10,000 more officers to be paid for by reversing some of the changes to capital gains tax. But as you suggest, there is a right old tussle over whether their sums add up, although this morning the Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott was insisting, yes, they did.
I'm this morning saying specifically that we are committing to spending, I think it's about £300 million of the 2.7 billion that you get by reversing the capital gains tax cut. We are committing this morning to spending it on 10,000 extremely needed policemen and women.
So why is Jeremy Corbyn campaigning on what would be natural Conservative territory?
I guess because he knows if he's to have any chance of winning, he can't just keep banging away on the Labour drum. You have to try and reach out a bit more. Interesting, too, where he's campaigning today. We've seen Mr Corbyn so far in sort of pretty traditional Labour areas. Today, he's down in the south of the country in what is not really a Labour area, again trying to reach out because he takes the view that actually the Tories should be vulnerable on crime, because recorded crime, that's what police officers jot down in their notebooks, has actually gone up, and certainly violent crime has gone up quite a lot. So the view in Team Corbyn is that there is a vulnerability here, although law and order is traditionally a Tory policy. That said, the Home Secretary Amber Rudd this morning insisting that the Tories have a good story to tell on crime.
The fact is that crime has fallen by a third since 2010. And you're right, there's also been control over budgets and less police officers. But we've been investing in the police force in areas where we believe they can make good progress with other elements of crime. But the point is, what really matters here is the outcomes. We have seen crime falling while budgets have been controlled. That surely is a successful outcome.
But, you know, one of the funny things, Vic, I said at the beginning, you seem to be taking a leaf out of Tony Blair's handbook. The difference is back in 1997, when we all remember tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, then crime was right at the top of the election agenda. Now, when you look at some of the polling done about the sort of issues that matter to voters, well, crime is right down at the bottom. I think only something like 8 or 9% of voters rate it as a really important issue. Top of the pile, of course, is Brexit, followed by the NHS.
Thank you very much, Norman.
Now, first of all today, Labour say they will recruit 10,000 more police officers in England and Wales if they win the general election, and they'll pay for the policy by reversing cuts to capital gains tax. But there's some confusion about how much it will cost. In a radio interview earlier this morning, Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott said the sum was only £300,000, but that would only amount to £30 per police officer. She then corrected herself and said the figure was £80 million. But it seems that too was wrong. In a further clarification, Labour said it would in fact cost £300 million a year by 2021-22. Now, in the past couple of hours, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, was asked about that figure and Diane Abbott's interview.
She corrected the figure, and that's the figure, and it will be paid for by not going ahead with the cuts in capital gains tax.
And is it a bit embarrassing that your Shadow Home Secretary got the numbers wrong? It's obviously trying to get voters to put their trust in you in this election.
Not at all. We've corrected the figure, and it will be absolutely clear now, today, and in the manifesto. I'm not embarrassed in the slightest.
Well, that was Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, obviously following an earlier interview that Diane Abbott, the Shadow Home Secretary, had done about the figures on policing. And I'm happy to say that Diane Abbott is here with me now. Despite what Jeremy Corbyn has said, it is embarrassing. It's embarrassing that you don't know your figures on a key policy.
I do know my figures, and as you will know, I did 7 interviews that morning, and that was the 7th, and I misspoke. But I do know my figures.
You didn't know them in that interview. Let's have a listen to it. In fact, it was with LBC and Nick Ferrari. Let's just take a listen, and viewers can make up their own minds.
So how much would 10,000 police officers cost?
Well, if we recruit the 10,000 police men and women over a 4-year period, we believe it'll be about £300,000.
£300,000 for 10,000 police officers? What are you paying them?
No, I mean, sorry.
How much will they cost?
They will cost... It will cost about £80 million.
About £80 million?
Yeah.
Diane Abbott, that is hugely embarrassing. It's not just misspeaking, to quote you a bit earlier. You just don't know your figures and you're not on top of your brief.
If I didn't know my figures, why was I able to do 6 other interviews and give the figures correctly? And you need to ask why the Conservative Party is so anxious to move the debate away from the 20,000 police officers.
We'll come on to that, because we're going to speak to a Conservative in just a moment. But back to that interview. Never mind that you did 6 or 7 interviews. This is now an election campaign. Front benchers and government ministers are expected to do reams of interviews. This was a major policy announcement for you. By your own words, you want to make this a cornerstone of your manifesto. You didn't know the figures.
I did know my figures, and if you'd listened...
Why didn't you say them then?
Because I misspoke, as you heard. If I didn't know my figures, I wouldn't have been able to repeat them correctly in 6 other interviews.
Which interviews did you correct them? Because I listened to one of those interviews. You didn't mention the figures at all. You said it was all going to be costed and it would be in the manifesto.
I did 6 other interviews. The point is...
But you didn't mention the figures in those other interviews. You decided to talk about the figures, and they are basic figures. £300,000, which, as Nick Ferrari said, would have meant £30 per police officer. That's embarrassing. You were then struggling to correct that figure. Did you actually not know them at all and you were guessing when you were asked about it on air? Or what is your explanation?
I knew the figures because I've repeated them many times
You
this morning.
haven't. I haven't heard you repeat them at all.
Well,
I've just heard them from that interview.
I can repeat them now. And I'm concerned that you don't want to talk about policing, which is something the public is concerned in, particularly the rise in violent crime. And you do want to go over and over. And Nick Ferrari...
But that's your fault, Diane Abbott. I mean, you want to talk about the issue, and we were all prepared to talk about the issue of policing and the claims that you are making that the police forces have been underfunded and you want to recruit more officers. But by going on air on a major interview where you just completely fluffed the figures, whether you knew them or you just chose not to say them or you couldn't remember them, actually doesn't do your cause any good.
The public will understand that you're not willing to talk about the real issues, and the real issues are that we have lost 20,000 police officers since 2010 and we're seeing a rise in violent crime.
You want to be Home Secretary.
You
want to be Home Secretary. How do you think an interview like that... We couldn't find the figures in a press release, by the way, earlier, so I do dispute you claiming that you did know those figures. And if you didn't know those figures, how can you claim to want to be Home Secretary in charge of the police forces of England and Wales? Do you think you've instilled confidence in either the police forces or the voters?
People that listened to any of the interviews I gave this morning, with the exception of the LBC interview, will know that I do know the figures. And I wish you were prepared to talk about policing.
Yeah, and we are going to talk about policing, which is why we have Dominic Raab, a Conservative, on the programme. I'll talk to him about that. But people will be worried that you are not across what you should be in terms of this brief that you came on the airwaves to announce as a key part of your policy. I mean, do you think it's important to attach the right figures to major spending commitments in this election?
Of course I think that, and that's why I attached the right figures in 6 interviews out of 7. I also think it's important that a major programme like yours is prepared to talk to the Labour spokesperson about policing.
Yes.
Because people deserve to know what the Labour Party is saying.
All right, well, let's talk about how you're going
issues.
to pay for it, which is by reversing the cuts to capital gains tax. So what level of capital gains tax will it be under Labour?
We are going to reverse the cuts in capital gains tax in order to fund a number of
No,
things,
I understand that, but what level will it be?
Including the 10,000 police officers. But just let me say why it's important to have 10,000 more policemen, because we've lost 20,000 under Theresa May and we've seen a rise in violent crime. We currently have some of the lowest rates of capital gains tax in Europe.
Right, but what are they? What will they be under Labour? If you win the election, what will you reverse the cuts to be? What will the 2 levels of capital gains tax be?
We will bring them back to where they were before. That's the point.
And what are those levels?
The point is that it will save us nearly £2.7 billion, and that's what we're going to use, both to pay for the 10,000 policemen and for other areas of our manifesto. And just in case you're saying that none of it's costed, we will produce a manifesto which is costed and is paid for. And we hope, as the campaign goes on, that people like yourself will be more willing to talk about the issues.
And we really will. But I think what voters will want to know is that they can trust you with the figures and with the finances. And just one last time, because I fear you don't know what the levels of capital gains tax are now and what they would be if you did reverse them. Yes, it would raise £2.7 billion. That is the figure you put out. But what will the levels of capital gains tax be?
It's not the figure that we've put out. That's the figure in the government's own Red Book, that if we reverse the cuts that the government has announced, that we will raise at least £2.7 billion. And we believe that we can put that money to better use than on tax cuts for the top 5%.
Dominic Raab, let's have a look at the substance of this issue, because, as Diane Abbott says, there have been cuts since there's been a coalition government and a Conservative government. Last month, the lead inspector of policing in this country said it is in a potentially perilous state, the issue of policing. Now, that's some message for the Conservatives to take into election after being in power for 7 years.
Well, that's obviously not our message. Our message is that actually, if you look at the crime survey for England and Wales, crime overall is down by a third. Violent crime since 2010 is down by 22%.
Not according to police recorded crime.
Sorry, Jo, can I just finish the answer? And we tend to rely on the crime surveys now more than the police recorded crimes because they're regarded as a more credible gauge. But certainly it's also true to say, even on the crime survey, that there's been an uptick in violent offences against the person, although the ONS say it's not statistically significant. But the raw truth is you're not going to get the investment in policing or the NHS or any of our other public services unless you've got strong handling of the economy. And just look at the shambles today of Diane's handling of those basic figures on one policy.
We've done that.
Imagine for a moment it was inflicted on the economy as a whole.
Right, well, we've done that and we've interviewed Diane about those figures. Let's get back to the substance, which are cuts.
Well,
that's what we're going to look. That's what we've got to look forward to under a Conservative government, a further cuts to policing. Is that right?
No, look,
so there aren't going to be any cuts, further cuts to policing?
Jo, I was asked to come on to talk about Brexit, but I'm very happy to talk about crime. You'll get our proposals when the manifesto comes out, but at the moment, look, we're happy to talk about our record. Yes, there have been some difficult decisions when it comes to police budgets.
Police budgets have shrunk by 22% on average.
What the public care about most is what's happening to crime, down by a third, violent crime down by 22% on the Crime in England and Wales survey. Those are the facts.
Right.
But even the ONS says there is a measurable increase in violent crime.
They said it was statistically insignificant.
No, they also said there was a measurable increase, and you will know that violent crime, particularly gun crime and knife crime, is what frightens the public.
I agree,
most.
but it's down by 22% since you guys were last on the watch.
ONS
and
says
you
it's
can't
gone up.
answer the basic figures. How are you going to pay for this? Or how many police you're going to put on the street?
You can't answer questions about your record in losing police officers.
I can say, look, we've made some difficult decisions, but crime down overall, violent crime down by 22%.
So why is the independent watchdog warning that what is happening is an unconscious form of rationing? Well, those were her words. If you are wanting to be measured on your record, according to the independent watchdog, that record is not very good.
Well, look, you can take a selective quote from...
Well, it's not a selective quote. This is the lead inspector, her inspectorate and
but what I'm going to point to is since 2010, 7 years, what has happened to crime, and in particular violent crime, which is the attack that Labour are going on, and it's down. And the public know it. When I knock on doors, no one seriously thinks Diane Abbott or Jeremy Corbyn
You've just said there's been an uptick, even if you say it's statistically irrelevant.
Hang on. Do you accept that knife crime and gun crime...
I think Joe's asking the questions.
Yeah,
you're trying to answer them. You're having enough trouble with that man, so I'll take questions from Joe.
Do you accept that knife crime and gun crime has gone up in the Metropolitan Police area?
Well,
are you denying that?
Sorry, Diane. If you're talking specifically about London, I don't have the geographical figures. What I've said very clearly is England and Wales, violent crime down by 22% since 2010. Yes, there's been an increase recently, but even the ONS, the guardian of the statistics, say it's statistically insignificant. We'll run on our record. You've got nothing credible to say on this issue. No one out there trusts you on this issue because you can't get the basic facts right.
Well, as it so happens, there was a press release that was put out by Labour which did mention the £300 million figure as the cost. Diane didn't use it and didn't seem to know it in that interview.
I did use it in other interviews.
But you didn't use it in that interview. You must accept that does reduce your credibility. It allows your opponents to attack you in the way Dominic Raab is.
I think it reduces the media credibility because they're not prepared to talk about.
Well, you can distract by blaming the media, Diane Abbott, but it doesn't help your cause if you give ammunition to your opponents. What does it do to Labour campaigners out on the streets when they're having to do and fight fires, unnecessary fires, on a key bit of policy from Labour?
What people want to know is what this government's going to do about the rising gun crime and knife crime in areas like London. And this is what we're not hearing from Dominic Raab.
Right. I mean, let's talk about the figures again. Hang on. Let's talk about the figures, though, broadly. You're right. The ONS does say that the uptick in violent crime is pretty small at the moment, but they do say it is a warning of what is to come. If you do look at London, then there has been an increase in knife crime that Cressida Dick says she is extremely worried about. Are you saying that has nothing to do with 22% cuts on average across police forces?
What I'm saying is across the board, what the people, voters care about is not what we put in terms of either money ultimately or in terms of numbers of police officers or police stations. They care about the end product, and crime is down by a third, violent crime is down by 22%. But we are not for a moment complacent. And if you look at the changes we've made on things like stop and search, but also on things like sentences for knife possession, we will continue to be absolutely vigilant and have zero tolerance on those most serious levels of crime. But what we're not going to do is, I'm afraid, take one isolated statistic for one isolated area and not defend our record nationally,
but the ONS,
which is strong.
Yeah, but hang on, the ONS does say even after taking better reporting into account, homicides, American term, and knife crimes are showing small but genuine increases. And I put it to you again, people may ask, if cuts are going to continue under a Tory government, if you win the election, then those figures are only going to increase.
What I think the country understands is we have to cut our coat according to our cloth.
So you are going to go for
can't rely
further
on the Labour Party for that. And at the same time, we can reform our public services, make them deliver something like the third cut in crime that we've seen, 20% cut in violent crime, and those two things are not mutually exclusive. But you've got to trust the strong leadership, and only the Tories are giving it to you.
Right. Looking at this issue, I mean, I remember with Tony Blair, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. It's not the #1 issue for voters, is it, Philip Cowley? Could it become a much bigger issue in this election campaign?
I don't think so. I think the whole exchange has been sort of symbolic of the election so far, really, because you've got Labour putting out policy, which they've been doing almost day on day since the election was called. And actually policy which on the whole polls very well when you poll about the individual policies. They're quite popular policies. And the attack then comes not on the policy detail, but on whether Labour can deliver the policy. And that basically is what we're going to see, I think, week in, week out for the rest of the election. And I think that's why, if there is a import to Diane's suboptimal interview this morning, that's it. It's because it speaks to competence, which is the attack line that the Conservatives are pushing. So in the exchange we've just had, it's all been policy detail against competence. And that's what we're going to see for the next 5 or 6 weeks.
Dominic Raab, you're staying with us. Diane Abbott, thank you.
Now, on the day the Labour Party announced a new flagship policy of taking on 10,000 extra police officers in England and Wales, the Shadow Home Secretary appeared confused in a radio interview about how much it would all cost. Diane Abbott suggested a range of figures which varied by tens of millions of pounds. Afterwards, she says she misspoke about Labour's new policy and had got it correct in other interviews. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, insisted he wasn't embarrassed by her difficulties with the numbers. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, John Pinar.
There, over the road, you know him, Labour's leader, promising to make the streets safer. 10,000 more police on the beat, catching more criminals and paid for by the better off, using capital gains tax the Tories plan to cut.
What we're putting forward is a proposal to increase police numbers. The Conservatives have cut by 20,000. We're putting 10,000 more police officers out there because it is a question of community policing and community involvement. There are many causes for crime, and they have to all be addressed. It's a collective approach.
But Labour's been hounded by tricky questions. Could they afford it? The parties suggested the same money could go on schools or welfare. Just examples, they say now. And what about the money?
How much would 10,000 police officers cost?
Well, if we recruit the 10,000 police men and women over a 4-year period, we believe it'll be about £300,000.
£300,000 for
Sorry,
10,000 police officers? What are you paying them?
No, I mean, sorry.
How much will they cost?
They will cost. It will cost about £80 million.
I don't understand. What is he or she getting? 80 million divided by 10,000 equals 8,000. So, what are these police officers going to be paid?
We will be paying them the average...
Has this been thought through?
Of course it's been thought through.
First it was thousands, then it was millions. It's not the sort of thing which encourages people to trust you, is it?
It's been clarified. It's absolutely clear what the cost of this will be, 300 million.
Just how strong is your faith and trust in your Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott?
Diane is fine, and Diane has my full support.
She clearly does, and it's £300 million, not 80. Diane Abbott brushed off the mix-up, or tried to.
I do know my figures, and as you will know, I did 7 interviews that morning, and that was the 7th, and I misspoke, but I do know my figures.
That settled that, or did it? Trust's a problem for some of the voters in this part of Southampton in one of the tiny handful of seats Labour holds in the South East.
I believe that the Tories run the country like a business, where Labour seems to borrow a lot of money and just rely on other people to pay it back later on in life.
You don't think much of it. What about Jeremy Corbyn?
Corbyn isn't really my politician, although at least I've got a little bit of respect for the fact that he's more of a Labour man than perhaps they've had in the past. So, but...
He's sincere and honest, anyway. He's got convictions.
Yes. Although I haven't got a lot of faith in him as a politician.
Are you willing to give Labour a chance this time?
I'm willing to give Labour a chance as long as they're willing to help the working class people.
And do you think maybe they are in the business of doing that?
I'd like to think so.
This election's more about leadership, about the character of rivals than any I can remember since Margaret Thatcher first won. But policies that touch the lives of millions matter too, and law and order is one of those. Just now, Labour's fighting to regain trust on policies and personalities, and the Tories need that advantage. Police funding has been protected since the last election, but before that, it was cut back severely.
We have reduced the number of policemen on the street from 2010, but because the police have been spending that money wisely, and because we've worked with them on reform, there's been a reduction in crime of nearly a third since 2010. We believe you can protect funding and also reduce crime.
Hello, Bobby.
Leaders like children at election time. Jeremy Corbyn seems to mean it, but he needs Britain to like him enough to make him Prime Minister. That's a much bigger ask. John Pienaar, BBC News, Southampton.
There was embarrassment and humiliation for Labour's Shadow Home Secretary today after she stumbled over numbers during an agonising interview on police costs. Announcing plans for thousands of new officers for England and Wales, Diane Abbott suggested they would cost a Labour government an average of £30 each. She later told ITV News she'd simply misspoken, but the gaffe was seized upon by her political rivals, as our political correspondent Emily Morgan reports.
They wanted law and order to dominate election coverage today, but Diane Abbott's pledge to put 10,000 more police officers on the streets quickly came unstuck. When asked how much it would cost on LBC this morning, Labour's Shadow Home Secretary floundered.
If we recruit the 10,000 police men and women over a 4-year period, we believe it'll be about £300,000.
£300,000 for
Sorry,
10,000 police officers. What are you paying them?
No, I mean, sorry.
How much will they cost?
They will cost. It will cost about £80 million.
Given another chance to get her figures right, she again appeared confused.
80 million divided by 10,000 equals 8,000. So, what are these police officers going to be paid?
We will be paying them the average...
Has this been thought through?
Of course it's been thought through.
Diane Abbott, would you like to clarify how much it will cost for your policing policy?
From 2021 to 2022, it will cost £300 million a year.
Why did you get the figures so wrong? Why are you not on top of your brief?
I'm completely on top of my brief. I misspoke this morning. It was the 6th interview out of 7.
Are you not embarrassed by this? You want to be the Home Secretary.
I did 7 interviews, 1 I misspoke.
Her leader, Jeremy Corbyn, also denied that one was an embarrassment.
We've corrected the figure and it'll be absolutely clear now, today and in the manifesto. I'm not embarrassed in the slightest.
Diane Abbott wants to work here. As Home Secretary, she says she will reverse the Conservative cuts to forces. 20,000 police officers, she says, have disappeared from our streets since 2010. It's a policy that had left the government having to defend its own record.
We have reduced the number of policemen on the street from 2010, but because the police have been spending that money wisely and because we've worked with them on reform, there's been a reduction in crime of nearly 1/3 since 2010.
All this, though, is being drowned out and questions are now being raised about Labour's own credibility. Emily Morgan, ITV News in Westminster.
Our political editor, Robert Peston, is in Westminster. Robert, clearly an embarrassing gaffe for Labour, or is it actually worse than that, do you think?
Well, look, recruiting a lot more police officers is a policy that would have been, most MPs, Tories and Labour say to me, a popular policy. But of course all of that has been overshadowed by Diane Abbott's gaffe. I've spoken to a large number of Labour MPs. They are mortified, and on the Tory side of the campaign it's brilliant news for them because broadly they just have to shut up shop, which is what they've done today. Let all the focus be on Labour, and with Labour behind in the polls, it's an own goal they can ill afford.
Yeah, well, you say that, but the Prime Minister herself also still facing questions today over her Brexit bust-up with the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker.
Yeah, out and about in the West Country today, she said that what this showed is that she has to be tough in negotiations with the rest of the EU. I think a bloody difficult woman is how she described herself. And I think there are 2 important ways of looking at this. Actually, on the doorstep, and again, Tory MPs and Labour MPs say this to me, this has gone down well for her because she is seen as a tough negotiator, and the revelation that this dinner seems to have been difficult simply reinforces in many people's minds the idea that you want a tough negotiator as Prime Minister. There is a separate issue, of course, which is people involved in the negotiations show that this increases the risk of Brexit negotiations collapsing in a way that would damage us. That will be very bad for Britain. Whether that's bad right now for her electoral prospects, I'm afraid, is an altogether different matter.
Robert Peston, thank you.
They wanted to focus on police numbers, but Labour's campaign was waylaid today by numbers of another kind, as Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott got into a complete mess as she tried to explain the costs of Labour's pledge to put an extra 10,000 bobbies on the street. And Theresa May couldn't quite escape the row over her awkward Brexit dinner with European President Jean-Claude Juncker either, as she claimed it showed the country needed a bloody difficult woman in charge. As the campaign heats up, the direction Britain takes in the next few years is up for grabs, as our political editor Gary Gibbon now reports.
Labour pledged today that it would recruit an extra 10,000 police officers if elected. Labour said it would pay for that by allocating some of the money it'll save by reversing cuts in capital gains tax. Labour says it's to reverse cuts of nearly 20,000 in police numbers that have happened over the last 6 years. On a radio interview, Labour's Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott was asked about the numbers.
So how much would 10,000 police officers cost?
We believe it'll be about £300,000.
£300,000?
Sorry,
10,000 police officers? What are you paying them?
No, I mean, sorry.
How much will they cost?
They will cost... It will cost about £80 million.
Don't understand. If you divide 80 million by 10,000, you get 8,000. Is that what you're going to pay these policemen and women?
No, we're talking about a process over 4 years.
I don't understand. What is he or she getting? 80 million divided by 10,000 equals 8,000. So, what are these police officers going to be paid?
We will be paying them the average...
Has this been thought through?
Of course it's been thought through.
Why are you not on top of your brief?
I'm completely on top of my brief. I misspoke this morning. It was the 6th interview out of 7.
We're going this way.
And in the last interview of the day, a chance to relive it all.
Let's just take a listen and viewers can make up their own minds.
How much will they cost?
They will cost... It will cost about £80 million.
About £80 million?
Yeah.
Is it a bit embarrassing that your Shadow Home Secretary got the numbers wrong? You're obviously trying to get voters to put their trust in you in this election.
Not at all. We've corrected the figure and it will be absolutely clear now, today and in the manifesto. I'm not embarrassed in the slightest.
In Cornwall, a very different and rigidly on-message campaign. The Prime Minister was asked about EU sources who came away from dinner with her in Downing Street last week thinking she was deluded about the challenges of Brexit and seemed to be living in another galaxy.
Reports I've seen are, I have to say, Brussels gossip. If you look at the statement that the European Commission made after the meeting I had with Jean-Claude Juncker, they said that actually those talks were constructive.
That's something short of an outright denial. Not surprising, as Jean-Claude Juncker himself on Saturday hinted on camera at his frustration with number 10.
Our British friends, not all of them, do underestimate the technical difficulties we have to face.
For now, Theresa May is wallowing in the tough image. In one interview today, boasted of having been described in the past as a bloody difficult woman. Just what she thinks the voters want at the negotiating table. Turning up for his first day as editor of the Evening Standard, George Osborne proving he's mugged up on the lingo.
We've got a paper to get off stone, so I better get started. Thank you very much.
The former Chancellor chose Brussels twists knife on Brexit as his first headline, and the paper's first opinion leader on his watch twisted the knife on Theresa May, saying that the problem comes when the election campaign amounts to no more than a slogan. The European Parliament's representative to the Brexit talks, Guy Verhofstadt, mocked Theresa May's slogan, tweeting, "Any Brexit deal requires a strong and stable understanding of the complex issues involved. The clock is ticking. It's time to get real."
Well, Theresa May and her team are convinced this is all actually playing very well for her. You can see her sort of channeling Margaret Thatcher meets Elizabeth I, Gloriana, in some of those clips, and they think what the voters want is a tough character who will negotiate hard with the EU. But you can also find people, some of them Conservatives, one of them probably the editor of the London Evening Standard, who are a bit wary of all of this, I think, and worry that Theresa May may be, with all this rigidity, pushing herself into an awkward cul-de-sac. As for Diane Abbott, well, moments like this do happen, whether it's because of brain freeze or because of a lack of briefing, but people around Jeremy Corbyn were hoping that this moment, the actual election period, because of the rules that govern broadcasting, the need for balance, this would be the moment when they would grow the vote, because the voters would get to hear more of them unmediated. The problem is, if you want the centre of the political stage and you walk onto it and you can't remember your lines, it looks awful.
Thank you, Gary. Well, with me now, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry.
Emily Thornberry, let's start with the bloody difficult woman, the Prime Minister. As one yourself, you'd presumably appreciate her adopting that stance in the negotiations.
Well, I think the truth is that she paints herself as a bloody difficult woman or a Margaret Thatcher figure, but I think this is less Margaret Thatcher and more Veruca Salt. I think you just simply can't stand there and say, I want, when you're negotiating. What you have to do is you have to persuade the other side that you have some ideas that will be good for both sides. You need to be able to calm down and you need to be able to make friends and be prepared to compromise. And, and we all want to... I mean, otherwise, we are heading for a hard Brexit. We are heading for no deal. And she must back off. And we need to have a strong Brexit, but a strong Brexit is about a deal that works for the British economy. We're talking about people's jobs. You know, that's the important thing.
Well, you mentioned ideas there, so that brings me on to another bloody difficult woman, the Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott. I mean, when you listened to that, did you cringe inwardly?
We've all been there, we've all been there, you know, and it is very difficult until you've done a television interview. You know, in the end, I know this, let me just share a secret. We're all people and we can make mistakes, and she misspoke and she did a series of interviews and she got the numbers wrong on one occasion.
This is her policy, and she gave the impression, as someone who's trying to form a government in waiting, she could do maths less well than an 8-year-old.
Well, she's a very bright woman, and you know what's really important is it more important for us to be giving money to the very richest people and cutting capital gains tax, or should we be putting 10,000 more police officers on the streets? Because that's what makes a difference to people's lives.
But when you've got a Shadow Home Secretary who apparently can't add up, you have the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, yesterday, who's pictured beneath a banner of Stalin and the Syrian regime flag. I mean, you're supposed to be preparing to go into number 10. Does anyone believe that?
What matters, you know, is the ideas. What matters is the way in which you want to lead Britain. Who is it that you want to look after when you're in government? When you are exercising power, who do you have in your mind?
And if you can't express those ideas credibly, that is a problem, isn't it?
Well, I'm here trying to express them credibly today.
Well, what about Diane Abbott?
What I'm saying is that it is better for us to spend money on 10,000 police officers than it is to cut the taxes of the very richest. And I hope people hear that, because I think that speaks the truth to people. Because, you know, they can see that crime is rising, and they think there should be more police officers on the beat.
How much damage do you think she's done today?
I think that when the Tories say that this is... I think they said they referred to this as a ridiculous policy. How ridiculous is it? We need to have more police officers on the beat because crime is going up. It's as simple as that.
Very quickly, you've had your share of personal gaffes. What advice would you give to Diane personally tonight?
I think you just have to keep going. I think the truth is that people want politicians to be people, but they also expect us to be superhuman, and we're not, and we will make mistakes at times. What can you do?
Emily Thornberry, thank you very much.
However hard the parties may try to control election campaigns, they are inevitably punctuated by unpredictable events, those Prescott punch moments. We've not had anything quite like that yet, but Labour today had its most awkward moment of the campaign so far. By far, a big announcement on police numbers, and then on LBC, the Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott faced presenter Nick Ferrari. This is Ms Abbott on the Daily Politics, listening back to that interview.
So how much would 10,000 police officers cost?
Well, if we recruit the 10,000 police men and women over a 4-year period, we believe it'll be about £300,000.
£300,000 for 10,000 police officers? What are you paying them?
No, I mean, sorry.
How much will they cost?
They will cost... It will cost about £80 million.
About £80 million?
Yeah.
Seem worse on Dragon's Den. Our political editor, Nick Watt, is here. Nick, it was a pretty excruciating listen.
Yes, excruciating, embarrassing. Those are the adjectives that were thrown around today, and that was from the Labour side. You know, as a senior politician, things are going really badly when your fellow front benchers, in this case on the Labour side, are joking with Conservative ministers on the other side about how badly you have done. Now, privately, Diane Abbott is telling friends that this was a car crash interview. And what one friend said, it's a bit like one of those moments where you wake up and you think, was it really that bad? And the answer is, yes, it was.
Right. these accidents happen, and this is not the first time Nick Ferrari has trapped someone in that situation, because we had Natalie Bennett at the last general election campaign of the Greens. The question is whether it's telling you or whether there's something more systematic that it plays to.
Well, the danger is this, is that it makes Labour look dysfunctional, and it plays into the Conservative narrative of this election that you have certainty with them and chaos under a future Labour government. And interestingly, it does show that there are poor relations between two of the leading members of the Shadow Cabinet, who are, of course, old comrades on the left. That's Diane Abbott, who's meant to introduce these 10,000 extra police officers, and John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, who is meant to pay for them. And I understand that Diane Abbott, until 2 o'clock this morning, was poring over a Labour document on this, because she feared that the real weak spot for her in her interviews this morning would be that Labour had indicated a number of policy areas that would be paid for from the pot that she was using. That's the £2.7 billion from reversing a cut in capital gains tax. Now, she had an answer to that when she was asked quite a complex question on the Today programme. She said, that was before the manifesto, this is the manifesto, and this is the first one on that. But then when she was asked that very, very simple question by Nick Ferrari, how much would it cost? Her friend said she was thrown off her stride.
Nick, thanks.